2, 1.
Hey guys, Jesse here. A while back, I had a client reach out to me to make a matching katana for the tanto that he bought from me earlier. My goal for this katana build is to incorporate everything that I learned from my Enma build in a bigger and better way. Not to say that Enma was bad, but there's a few things that I learned that I could definitely improve on next time around. Because this katana is supposed to be a matching katana to the tanto that I made before, I'm going to be making it out of twist Damascus. What you saw me just do was stack up my initial billet and weld it together. I'm taking all my standard precautionary steps to ensure that my forge welds later are perfect. You can probably also see it in this shot, but I got a new dust collection system for my grinder. It's from Magnomatic, and it's made for the knife maker, and it's doing pretty well so far. I also reorganized a lot of tools in my shop, so now I have a lot more space to do some table work. Do I still remember how to turn this on? I don't actually know if this will fit. The plan for this billet is pretty simple. I'm going to draw it out into a 1-inch square, break the corners, and then I'm going to twist it. What you just saw me do was one of my standard precautionary dips in my quench oil. Basically, when the quench oil is on the billet, and then I put it in the fire, all of the quench oil turns into like a layer of carbon soot, and it keeps the oxygen out from the center of the billet, which means that my welds will be hopefully a lot cleaner than if I didn't do it. In my opinion, it's the much simpler yet still effective way of keeping the billet clean as compared to something like wrapping the billet in sheet metal and then welding all the seams. If something is 99% as good, but takes 10 times less effort, I think I'm going to stick with that for the most part. While I draw this billet out, I think it's actually a good idea for me to explain how I got into knife making. In my last video, I asked what people wanted me to talk about in the voiceovers, and one of the things that a lot of people said was I should talk about how I got started, how I got into this really strange world of knife making. The thing about my journey into this craft was that it was actually kind of boring. I just watched some videos of it on YouTube and I was like, wait, this looks kind of easy. Why don't I just try it for pretty cheap? So I got some charcoal, some bricks and a hairdryer, and I put together a mini forge and I started forging. The first thing I made was a knife, and the knife was the most terrible knife that you could ever imagine. There was no edge, I made it out of mild steel, and there was a tang for me to slot into wood, but I didn't have any woodworking tools, so it was just a bare tang. And the experience left me a little disheartened, because what I thought was super easy ended up being a little bit more difficult than I thought. This is the biggest life hack for reducing rig. Look at this. Going back to my story, obviously my first couple works were really bad, but I just kept on watching more and more YouTube videos, and I really wanted to end up being one of the people that made what I saw in those videos. So basically, as the years went on and I got better tools, my passion for the craft kept growing. My process for learning new skills was basically I would see someone do it in a YouTube video, and I would try to replicate it myself, only to do it really badly. And then I would watch the YouTube video again, and then pick up smaller and smaller details that I would incorporate into the next time I did it. I don't know if this counts as being self-taught, because I watched so many YouTube videos, and none of the stuff was technically original, but the only formal teacher that I've ever had was Salem Straub, and I went up to his shop to study for about a week. Back to the build though, the bar right now was slightly bigger than 1 inch square. I didn't really get it to that final 1 inch because the handle was a bit too long for me to maneuver, but after cutting it off, I went back to the flat dies and I got it to that final dimension. To break the corners, I put a stop block size of around 1.25 inches, and I carefully put it on a 45-degree angle and broke the corners. If I were to do it all over again, I would choose a stop block size of around 1 1/8 inches, just so that when I twist it, it would have been a slightly more round shape, but there's nothing wrong with really 1 1/4 inches. It just made my job a little bit tougher later on. I think we're ready for a twist. One of the more difficult things about having a billet this long and doing it in twist Damascus is that I have to make sure that the twist is even throughout the entire billet. And the thing that controls the evenness of the twist is the evenness of the temperature that I twist it at. Now, I don't have an oxyacetylene torch or an oxypropane torch. I just have like a forge and a propane torch. So what I did was I carefully placed the billet inside of the forge to sort of predict where the piece would be heated up the most. As you can see here, the parts that I want to twist more, I put under the direct flame. My forge is a 2-burner forge, but I ran it on 1 burner for the twisting because then it would be easier to control where I put my heat. You can see here that the center was the most sparsely twisted, so I put that part under the forge, and right here you can see that it's actually the brightest, which means it would twist the fastest. Okay. Oh my gosh. Now that I was happy with the amount of twist that I put in the billet, it was time to cut off the ends that weren't twisted and get it back in the forge and flatten it out into sort of the preform for the katana. The stock that I used to start off Enma was 3/8 of an inch thick by 1 inch wide. For this blade though, since it's made of twist Damascus, I want to forge it slightly thicker than I did for Enma, which means that the starting billet that I want needs to be slightly thicker than that of Enma. I have this bad habit though of using the flat dies when the combo dies would be much more efficient. Here, I used them because I was scared to like tear the billet apart, but in hindsight, it would have been much faster and honestly just as safe to just use the combo dies. One of the really bad things about these big flat dies is that since they have so much thermal mass, they just suck the heat out of the piece. And as you can see here, wherever I press, all of the heat just disappears, which means I can't really press it for as long. With the billet at the final thickness, but not the final width, I took it over to the post vise and I used my least favorite tool in the shop, the angle grinder. The purpose of the angle grinding was to eliminate the chance of having a cold shut move its way along the edge and into the meat of the blade. I didn't really care about the face of the billet as much because that would become the side of the blade later on, and when I'm doing my rough grinding, I can grind all those out before the heat treat. One of the other things that I tried to keep in mind was that the katana had to have a distal taper. I wanted to have the blade portion right above the habaki be much thicker than it was at the tip. In order to sort of prepare for that, I drew out the blade to its final thickness, but I left one of the ends of the bar a lot wider than the other. I think I'm going to use the Mjolnir. Like I did for Enma, I'm going to do the traditional route of cutting off the tip. And also like Enma, because I'm not using traditional steels, there's really not much purpose to doing this. But it's a katana, and I want to sort of like pay homage to the traditional techniques. Whoa. I think I want to grind that chisel flat. This grinding operation right here is actually a pretty good test for the New Dust collection, because the sparks come off hotter and they come off in a greater quantity. I think it did pretty well. To some of you, it's probably a surprise that I've made it this far into the video without complaining about the temperature yet, and surprise, surprise, there actually wasn't that much to complain about. The weather was pretty nice in Arizona. It hasn't hit like the everyday triple-digit temperatures yet, and it actually made the forging pretty comfortable. But yeah, the first step in my forging operation after bending the tip back upwards was to sort of finalize the distal taper on my preform. I did a lot of it in the press, but it wasn't perfect, and with the hand hammer, I have enough control to actually make it perfect. Next was to forge the spine bevels. The spine bevels are traditionally called the muni in Japanese, and I did not forge these in on Enma. I ground them in, and in the spirit of doing this one better, I decided to forge them in to pretty much completion. As I worked my way down the blade, I definitely got into a rhythm. First, I forged the spine bevels, the muni, and then I did the spine side bevels, and then I finalized it with the blade bevels. This made it so that as I worked my way down the blade, I could be confident in the geometry that I set beforehand. And I could actually use that geometry as a sort of metric to see how well my forging was as I got more and more tired. As I worked my way down the blade, there were a few things that made themselves very apparent to me. The first of which was that I definitely lost all my forging stamina. I think I kept most of my skill, but the rate at which I could actually let loose that skill was dropped significantly. Like I said before, I wanted the overall length of the blade to be 36 inches, including the tang. I was constantly checking with the tape measure to make sure that my blade didn't get too long and that my blade was actually the thickest where I wanted it to be. Here, to help speed up the drawing out of the tang, I was hammering on top of the horn. Because the horn was round, it helped the steel draw out a little bit faster and save me a little bit of energy. That's a bruise, that's a bruise, that's a bruise. I think this is a bruise. When I was happy with the cross-section of the blade along the entire length of it, it was time to forge the tip. I don't really know why I left it for last, but I kind of like that I did, because forging the tip was fun, and because I was already tired, it made the last section of the forging a little bit more fun. After studying the book on the katana from Yoshinda Yoshihara a little bit more, it became clear to me that the bend of the blade, or the sori, was very intentional in all good-looking katana. What I realized about the sori was that the bend wasn't really consistent throughout the whole blade. I think that the better looking katana had more of a bend closer to the habaki and were slightly straighter near the tip. I took a lot of time to ensure that the curve of the blade looked good before heat treat. Sense a lot of grinding in my future. Before I did any normalizations on this blade, I wanted to do just a little bit of rough grinding. My goal with this little bit of rough grinding was to leave it very, very thick still, but I wanted to finalize the profile and see some clean metal. Because this process is so aggressive on the belts due to the hardness of the scale, I was using an old purple belt here, and it actually worked pretty well. I'm kind of impressed with this abrasive. Really funny if it didn't fit. Okay. Okay, please tell me this closes. The two steels that I used for this Damascus pattern were 1084 and 5920. These two steels are fairly similar, and they really like 3 normalization cycles, the first of which is at 1650 degrees Fahrenheit, the second of which is at 1500 degrees Fahrenheit, and the third of which was at 1350 degrees Fahrenheit. For the normalization, the blade doesn't actually have to cool all the way to room temperature. It only has to cool to just barely not incandescent, which is around 700 to 800 degrees. Another cool thing is the concept of recoalescence. You can see here, there's like waves of red going through the blade. It's almost like a heartbeat. and this is due to the steel going through phase changes as the temperature drops. With the blade all normalized now, it was time to get it ready for the quench, and that involved getting my body weight behind the blade and grinding off a shit ton of material. One of the things that you might notice from me grinding that's different from all my past videos is that when I push on the grinder, it doesn't move, and that's because I finally fabricated myself a nice sturdy work table. It's one of those things that's harder to appreciate unless you've used the alternative for a long period of time, which is a bad workbench. It made it so that the grinding felt a lot faster than it did before, and even though it still took a decent amount of time, it was actually kind of nice. It's very, very thick still. It's like 1/8 of an inch thick on the edge. Actually, maybe even more, like 3/16. But I don't want this to crack, so I'm leaving it thick. Now that the blade was rough ground and ready for quench, it was time to throw it in the kiln at 1500 degrees Fahrenheit. I'm fairly certain that the austenizing temp for 1084 and 5920 is slightly lower than 1500, but it takes time for me to get the blade out of the kiln and into the oil, so it's nice to have that little extra room for error. Fingers crossed this is enough. Factor is a meal delivery service that makes meeting your nutrition goals easier than ever by delivering fresh, never frozen, dietitian-approved meals right to your doorstep. They're so easy to cook. In fact, let me show you how easy it is to take an uncooked meal and turn it into its cooked form. The reason that this is so great for me is because when I'm at the forge, I eat a lot less, simply because I know how much time it takes to get food ready. If I know that I have Factor boxes in the fridge that can be ready in 2 minutes, maybe I'll actually eat for a change. Factor has 35 different meals and over 60 add-ons to choose from. It's like an infinite buffet that you don't even need to drive to. You can get restaurant quality meals with things like shrimp, salmon, and even filet mignon. If you want to treat yourself one week, you can with the Gourmet Plus option. Like, look at the cook on this beef. Even when reheated, the cook is great. It's neither dry or tough. So yeah, with all that said, I suggest you head over to factor75.com or click the link below and use code JesseWho50 to get 50% off your first Factor box and 20% off your next box. That's code JesseWho50 at factor75.com to get 50% off your first box plus 20% off your next box while your subscription is still active. Whoa. Good thing is if it burns, there's no smoke. This wasn't in the script. Dude, what? Okay, good Martin colors. Alright. Kinda need that use. That's hot. Okay. Wait, use the edge. I sense that there's a lot of decarb and a pretty big warp, but nothing that can't be fixed later on. With the blade quenched, it was time to throw it back in the kiln for 2 2-hour-long temper cycles at 425 degrees. The plan was to straighten the blade after the second temper cycle in my 3-prong jig. That really...
blade size was perfect. No hidden cracks. Looks like I have some work to do.
So yeah, I'm not sure what it is about me and katanas, but I can never make them right first time. After analyzing the breakpoint of the two pieces, I deduced that there's nothing wrong with my steel. Rather, I think there's something wrong with my method of straightening. The 3-prong jig is very effective if done correctly, but it does apply a lot of stress on the blade. I think I also didn't fully grind out the stripes on the side of the blade. The only thing I can attribute that to is just laziness. I had no reason to not grind them out before heat treat, and that resulted in me breaking the blade in half. So I guess I paid the price. This isn't to say that I think the blade breaking was entirely bad. I think because of what I learned from the first one, I was able to forge the second one more efficiently and more accurately. And I think I can say with 100% confidence that I would prefer to have the second blade over the first blade. Alright, so this is after temper cycle 1 of blade number 2, and if you take a look, a little bent in the wrong direction. There's a lot of decarb on here, and I think if I grind through the decarb before the second temper cycle, I'll get a better look at how straight it actually is. Okay, after grinding off all the decarb, it's still pretty bent. But I've done a lot of things different from first time, and I think I won't be too scared to straighten this. If it breaks when I'm straightening it again, I think I'm gonna go cry. It's very springy. I have to crank it harder. That scared me. After some careful thought and a suggestion by my brother, the cameraman, I deduced that it would probably be a lot safer to use the carbide hammer to straighten the entire thing. I know that the carbide hammer is really good at straightening things, but I've never used it on something so bent. The way that the carbide straightening hammer works is that it sort of increases the surface area on one side because the carbide is so much harder than the steel. And by increasing the surface area, you bend it in the other direction. It worked pretty well, and I got the blade pretty much perfectly straight, but I can't emphasize how long it took to get it straight. I think it took me like 4 or 5 hours just to get it straight. There's one right there. There. This should be the thickest part. To help ensure that the thickness of my blade from the tip to the tang was actually what I wanted it to be, with a nice distal taper, I took readings of thickness every single 2 inches. Is that I sort of have a balloon in the center. The center is too thick, and I need to basically not touch this anymore. Now that I basically had a 3D model of the blade inside my head with measurements, it was time to take it back to the grinder and take off all the material that I needed to take off. Like I said before, the center of the blade was a lot thicker than I wanted it to be. My tang was actually slightly thinner than the center of the blade, and I really needed to make sure that I didn't touch that to ensure that my distal taper went from thick to thin with no bubbles in the center. I wish I could convey how satisfying it was to just like slide my hand along the geometry. It's so crisp. It's almost to what I want it to be at the end. Still a little heavy, but oh, the lines are just so good. Ever since I started knife making, I've always been pretty infatuated with the katana. There's a couple YouTube classics that I always like to rewatch, and I've probably watched 20 times each within my life. Those being the Man-at-Arms Kenosuke Katana, Reverse Blade Katana, Kilbo Katana, and then the more recent That Works Tanjiro Katana and the Call of Duty Katana. Pretty much everything I know about the process of making the katana come from these videos and the book that I have. One of the side effects of being such a big fan of katana is that when I actually hold something in my hand that looks like what I've been seeing my entire life, there's a part of my brain that just tickles. I'm not saying that my katana are anywhere near as close as good as the ones made by the masters, but I can't help but hope that as I keep making them more and more, they get closer and closer. As the geometry of the blade was nearing what I wanted it to be, it was time to take it to a 400 grit Trizac belt so that I could take away all of those deep scratches and make it easier to hand sand later on. One of the most difficult things for me to do on the grinder was to finalize the Yokote line or the tip. One small slip up and I would completely destroy the line. Pretty symmetrical. Can you clean up on the stones? Yeah. Damn. Reborn from the ashes of its cousin. With the blade final ground, it was time to finalize the geometry on the stones. The thing about katana is that they're not actually flat ground. They're actually really harshly convex ground. I don't have the confidence on the grinder yet to do the convex on the grinder, so I decided to opt for my 400 grit Otoma diamond stone. Because I knew that I wanted to finalize the geometry on the stones, I left the edge a lot thicker than I would have otherwise. Just for reference, if I do a flat ground blade that I intend to sharpen later without doing any convexing, I want to leave the edge at least under 10 thousandths of an inch. I think I left this blade at around 50 thousandths, so it took forever. I need to do all my 150 grit sanding with 3 sheets of this on the entire katana because I'm out of sandpaper. Gonna finalize the geometry. To ensure that all my lines stayed as crisp as I could keep them, I sanded the blade in 3 different sections: the tip, the spine, and the blade. I was kind of careful and I tried to keep the sanding lines in all different directions at the very tip, just so I could very plainly see the Yokote line as I was sanding. Oh my god, look how deep these scratches are from the grinder. They all have to come out by hand. That's actually really fun. I love my job. I wish I could be like all those Japanese bladesmiths that just say like, oh, I'm gonna send my blade off to a master polisher. And then they show nothing after that in the documentary, like that's the end of the entire blade. I'm not throwing shade, I'm just jealous. When I said that I sanded the blade in 3 sections before, that didn't include the spine bevels. I got these pretty close on the grinder, but there's a lot of cleanup that you can do with sandpaper, so I spent some time to clean those up on the 150 grit. I figure now's a good time to talk about what I watched during the hand sanding, and this time, because I just wanted to turn my brain off and enjoy the process a little bit, I just watched PewDiePie's Minecraft series, the original one. It's definitely not a super mentally stimulating series, but it makes me smile. Oh, okay, I think I'm done. With the blade sanded up to 400 grit, it was time to spray some fluid film on it and wrap it in tape so that I could start making the fittings without worrying about scratching the blade. That's also one of the reasons why I didn't immediately sand the blade up to 600 grit parallel scratches, because at that final really nice finish, if I even touch it with something else, I would want to resand it before I go to the etch. To give myself some peace of mind, I left the blade at 400 grit. It's time to start one of my favorite parts about making katana, the habaki. I was joking. It's really not fun to make at all. That said, the habaki is really, really important to the function of the katana. One of the things that it does is it helps keep the Tsuba or the guard locked in place. And on top of that, it also acts as one of the connection points between the katana and the saya. Another thing that it does is it helps absorb shock because it is made of a softer material than the blade. What you just saw me do was heat it up and quench it in water. Unlike steel, copper, when heated up to about a red hot temperature and quenched in water, becomes a lot softer. When you hammer copper, you introduce a bunch of dislocations into its microstructure, and these dislocations make it tougher to work with. By heating it up and quenching it in water, you sort of relax those dislocations, returning it back to its softer state. Throughout my bladesmithing career, I've made a total of 4 habaki, including this one. I like to think that I got slightly better at making them, going from the first to the second to the third, But when I was making this one, there were so many weird problems that I kept encountering. I expected it to take like maybe 2 hours max to make it, fit it up to the blade and shape it, but in reality, I think it took something like 5 hours. Now, I'm pretty confident in the heat treat of my blade, but that doesn't mean I wasn't scared to hammer on the tang a little bit. The Habaki has to be pretty much vacuum fit to the tang, and the only way to do that without some fancy CNC stuff is to hammer it on the tang. What you see me using here to cut the Habaki is a new portaband setup that I got from Harbor Freight. Yeah, I know it's Harbor Freight and their tools are kind of sketchy, but I really can't find anything bad to say about this one. Maybe the table is off kilter by like 1 degree, but that's not going to impact my work too much. This is the part of the Habaki that was the hardest to actually get it to fit up perfectly. The inside of the Habaki near the bend of the spine has to be pretty square. I had to go back and forth between so many different operations just to get that square, and I think that took up most of the Habaki making time. Next time I make a Habaki, I think I'm going to change my order of operations a little bit. This little filing operation would have been so much faster if I did it before I bent the Habaki at all. This small piece right here is also another annoying part about making the Habaki. The Habaki has to support the blade from the blade side and the spine side, so you have to solder in a little wedge on the side of the blade.
It's good enough of it to like saturate the inside.
The soldering wire that I'm using here is Stay Bright lead-free silver solder. In the future, I want to just use silver wire as my soldering wire, but I would like to get a better torch for that first. With the wedge soldered into the Habaki, it was time to sand out some of the excess solder and get it fit up to the tang. I definitely tend to use too much solder when I do these soldering operations, but in my opinion, it's better to be too safe than sorry. Just needs a tap. Just needs a tap. Never felt so happy in my life. Oh. With the Habaki now perfectly fitting to the tang, it was time to do something that I didn't do on Enma. Apparently Habaki are supposed to taper from base to tip by quite a bit, and on Enma, I kind of left them pretty much the same thickness. Here I'm just using my flat granite surface and some sandpaper to guarantee that the bottom was flat. Another annoying thing about sanding copper is that it transmits heat so well that even if I'm grinding the other side of the Habaki, I have to dip it in water really frequently. It's not just that it gets uncomfortable to hold, but it actually starts burning my hand. One of the really nice things about doing the Habaki first though, is that now that I have the Habaki perfectly fit to the tang, I can use it as like a stencil to draw the line that I need to carve through all of the other pieces of the handle.
I think I'm gonna give myself like as much as this much for a spacer. So much better to have too much than too little.
The last time I made these spacers, I basically drilled a bunch of holes and completely filed out the shape. This time, I only want to drill one hole and use the jewelry saw to cut out the shape. I always knew that getting decently familiar with the jewelry saw would be a good skill to have, but the first time I used it, I just broke so many blades, and I got really impatient and I didn't bother spending time to figure out how to actually use them. One of the things I learned from a friend that took a jewelry class was that you're supposed to keep what you're sawing in line with the arm that you're actually using to cut it. This will make it so that you don't get any unnecessary shoulder pain. After cutting the slots in both spacers, it was time to start thinking about the raw material for the guard. Right here, I have a sheet of stainless steel, and the plan was to do the exact same thing that I did for the spacers. Unfortunately, I think there was a little bit of a tactical error because my saw blades could barely touch the stainless steel. Oh boy.
That's really funny.
Okay, so I guess I could use brass for the guard and I could just like jewelry saw it.
That's actually kind of funny. I make the executive decision to stick with the stainless, then I immediately get a drill bit stuck in it.
This is one of those things that feels like a pretty big punch in the gut when it happens, but it gives me a reason to get better at the jewelry saw, and it made my life a lot easier later on because the brass is just so much simpler to work with than the stainless steel. This is the flow chart of what I need to do. Finish the guard, forge my carving tools, carve the handle, shape the handle so that then I can make the Fuchi and the Kashira, and then I start on the saya. Carving the slot on the guard was actually a lot harder than I thought it would be. The thing is that the guard material was a 1/4 inch thick, and I had to sort of worry about the angle at which I was holding the saw. This made it so that the top looked pretty good, but the bottom was really wavy, and I would have to fix it up later with a bunch of file work. I figured now's a pretty good time to talk about my design choices or ideas for all of the fittings. So this blade is for one of my clients, and he is a retiring meteorologist. And to sort of honor the fact that he was a meteorologist, I'm going to be designing the guard in the shape of a cloud. And sort of keeping with the theme of the weather, I'm going to be making the Menuki into little lightning bolts. I'm going to be putting a compass on the back end of the Kashira, and I'm going to be painting something known as the Fujiwara effect on the saya later. So stay tuned to see how those turn out. There's like a 10% chance it fits now. Oh my god. I'll use the spacer on the next fit up, but... This is one of those steps that if you go a little bit too far too fast, everything will be slightly wobbly. So I made sure to take my time and made sure that it was perfectly fit to the tang. This is the extent of my woodworking equipment. I need to make some more chisels. The chisels that I'm making are something called bullnose chisels. They're regular chisels with a bit of an angle, and the bottom is slightly rounded so that you don't carve perfectly flat. I also forged out a carving knife, but I didn't end up using it because one of my pocket knives was just a much better choice at the time. The steel that I used to forge these out of was Crew Forge V, and I did a fairly quick torch temper because I wasn't planning on putting these through too much abuse. The traditional wood for the handle and the saya is something called magnolia wood, but I didn't have any access to it, so I used the alternative, which was something called poplar. Poplar is fairly soft and it's pretty easy to chisel, and I had this board sitting in my garage, which means it was perfectly dry. To prepare for the carving, I got 2 1-foot long pieces of wood, and I went to the grinder and I sanded the fronts of them square as possible. The left, to the right, just in case I forget how I picked left and right. Wow, that is the straightest line I've ever drawn. It's very freaking close. Top Seppa, guard, bottom Seppa, and then ooh. With the slot now carved and the tang now fitting, it was time to glue these 2 pieces together. One of the things that I've always wondered when watching people glue together handles like this is how do you keep the glue from running into the center where the tang is actually supposed to be? And what I decided was that after gluing them together and clamping them, as the glue was drying, I would put the tang in and out of the hole just so that I would remove any wood glue that was attached to the tang once I pulled it out. This would make it so that all of the negative space would be taken up by the tang and there would be no glue taking up any of the space. Okay. After drying for 24 hours, it was time to shape the handle piece. I drew some lines on the outside just so I knew where the tang slot was, and then I took it over to the bandsaw and roughed the shape in just a little bit.
The Tsuka is supposed to be 9.5 inches long, or 8 sun.
One of the things that I've learned about handle design over the years is that it has to be fairly ovular with a very slim profile. And this is actually why I don't think it's a good idea to wear gloves when blacksmithing, and that's because the gloves add extra thickness to the handle, and the extra thickness makes your hand cramp more, it gives you less stamina. Just all the things that could be bad about a handle are accentuated with the glove.
Wow, I can see that line.
To help save some time and remove a lot of the bulk material on this handle, I took it over to the bandsaw and I just ripped off about 1/4 inch off of the sides. To shape this handle, the first thing that I did was break the corners. I think that this is one of the best ways to start shaping the handle, because if I immediately tried to go to round from the rectangle, I wouldn't be able to really gauge the depth of that round, and I would have a fairly weird looking handle that I wouldn't be able to ensure is actually symmetrical. By breaking the corners, I can sort of block in the shape and ensure that everything is about where it needs to be. When the shape was mostly there, I actually finalized it with the file. The file is much less aggressive, and it made sanding it a lot less scary because one wrong slip and this handle would go flying across the room and it would lose all of its shape. Now with the handle shape, it's time to start working on the Fuchi and the Kashira. I'm gonna be real, both the Fuchi and the Kashira were stressing me out a lot before I started making them. After a lot of careful thinking though, the method that I chose to create both the Fuchi and the Kashira was using sheet metal. The first thing that I would do was trace out the outline of the handle onto some sheet metal, cut it out perfectly, and that would create a ring with more sheet metal, and then I would weld them together and then grind them flat. I decided to choose this method because I wouldn't have to create any extra tooling, and I had a little bit more experience on the welder now.
Hey, would you look at that?
One thing about this welding method though, is that it's a little bit harder to create a slightly rounded Kashira. I was going to opt for both flat Fuchi and Kashira, so it didn't really matter too much, but if I were to make a rounded one, I would probably opt for the extrusion method.
This is sheet metal, so I can do this. Oh, it actually doesn't bend that easily. Oh. Alright, somehow I need to get this perfectly formed to the outside of this without breaking this.
On the surface level, I thought that this would be fairly easy, but after trying a hammer, hammering it on the horn, none of these were actually working that well. So then I just took it to the vise, and then I bent it with a pair of pliers. I have to give credit where credit's due though. I did get this idea from Tyrell Knife Works. I couldn't find any way to make them other than the extrusion method and maybe casting, and after seeing his video, it gave me the idea to actually just try this.
Oh!
Once I got the piece pretty much perfectly shaped to the handle, it was time to take it to the welder and weld the first seam. I really needed some fine motor control for this welding, so I didn't weld with gloves. I know it's not the best for my skin, but I only had to weld for like 10 seconds. After insetting the cap into the welded band, it was time to take it back to the welder and then weld it all together. After dipping it in water, it was time to take it to the grinder and clean up the sides just a little bit. I know the rough forge scale on the sheet metal looks pretty cool, but I prefer a cleaner finish on this katana because it's a more high-end piece. Because the Fuchi is at the top of the handle, it has to have the tang go through it. And because metal can't phase through metal without a slot, I had to carve another slot to the exact shape of the tang. Because I'm primarily a chef's knife maker, I like to think that working on all these katana have made me better at making chef's knives. All these intricate parts make it so that when I work on chef's knives, it's basically taking training weights off.
Okay, I wanted to fit just a little bit better.
After getting the fuchi that fit perfectly to the tang and to the piece of wood, it was time to take it to the grinder and give it a semi-final finish.
Fuchi onto the Tsuka, push all the way down, handle, look at that.
I made the Kashira in basically the exact same way that I made the fuchi, except for after when I welded everything together, I didn't have to carve the slot to fit the tang. That's because the Kashira is at the base, and the slot goes in the other direction. With the Kashira now basically formed to its final shape, it was time to carve the slot that I mentioned earlier. This slot is going to be used for the Ito wrap later on. Now, I've seen a lot of Kashira, and the slots range from rectangles to ovals to sometimes even circles. And for mine, I wanted it to be an oval. I will say, one of the least satisfying things you can do with a file is use a dull file on some softwood. It felt like it was barely cutting the wood, and it also felt like I was making no progress.
I think I'm actually kind of impressed with these calipers. They feel like they're kind of worth the price. You know what? I think I need more lines.
The plan with these lines was because a cloud is such a weird shape to draw, and it's fairly organic, I wanted a set of layout lines to sort of guarantee that what I was drawing was actually symmetrical. After roughing in the shape of a guard to a perfect oval, I then used my layout lines to sketch some more lines in the shape of the cloud that I wanted.
Oh, the balance is much better now that the Habaki lost like half its weight and the guard also lost like half its weight. I need to make sure to keep my scribe at the same angle because it's like not the same all the way around.
Because I now had the guard shape, I figured it was a good time to shape the Seppa to what they would be at the end. I didn't really go too fancy with these, I just left them as the same shape as the handle. Once I got those ready, it was time to final polish the Habaki so that I could get ready to carve the saya. The reason that I need the Habaki pretty much final shape is because the saya needs to fit the Habaki perfectly with an airtight seal. If I were to shape the saya and then change the Habaki later, I would lose that airtight seal. With the Habaki shape, it was time to cut the wood for the saya carving. I got the same wood, poplar, and then I cut 2 long sections along the length of the board. The reason I was so excited there was because that was the first time I've seen the bare metal blade with all of the fittings. Now, the fittings weren't final shaped, but they gave me a pretty good idea of what it would feel like to hold the final blade. If you were to read through the comments on my video making Enma, you'd probably find a fairly common sentiment, and that was, how come you didn't make a saya for Enma? And the most obvious reason is that I didn't have enough time. I had a very tight upload release for Enma, and I had no previous experience making something like that. So now that I have more time and I'm ready to learn, why not make it?
I'm gonna cut it inside for now. It's like the surface wood is the hardest because it's like been exposed to air or something. once I get through that surface wood, it actually isn't too bad.
When I had the bulk of the blade material cut out, it's time to start thinking about that Habaki fit up. The Habaki fit up was the thing that I was stressing over the most when making the saya. It's pretty obvious that I'm not a woodworker, I'm a metalworker, so the fact that I had to do this in wood, where if I chip off a piece it's impossible to repair it, that just kind of scared me a bit.
Alright, I need to ensure that I don't carve past it.
The knife that you see me using here is a Jaeger MV2. It's probably not traditional woodworking equipment, but I just sharpened it, and the blade is thin enough to where I can do some pretty accurate cuts with it.
Okay, the Habaki will end up going like flush with the outside, and then if I do this, it'll be like in, airtight seal. It's gonna be good.
This step took me about 5 or 6 hours for both sides, but I'm not gonna lie, it was one of the most rewarding things ever.
That's pretty good. This ridge is the thickest point, and it's thicker here than it is for most of the blade. So if I can get a contact reading, then I'll be able to know where to remove material, like pretty much along the entire thing.
Traditionally, saya makers actually did something very similar. Rather than coating their blade in permanent marker though, they used just regular oil. And they would put the blade in, take it out, and just look for shiny spots. It's kind of like filing down a key for a power hammer. You want there to be a lot of surface area of contact, but it doesn't have to be 100%, or else you'd be doing it forever.
I think I can fit it in with the Habaki now. Wait, this is so exciting. Oh, that's pretty airtight. I did not think that I was actually going to be able to do this.
It was actually so cool to be able to feel the blade go into the saya and feel all of that surface area of contact. It made the saya feel secure and that it was actually protecting the blade.
Wait, how did I actually do this? That's so good. That's actually so good. Oh, wait, that's so cool. Oh my gosh.
The only thing that I could compare that feeling of happiness to is, actually there's nothing. I've never been happier in my life. Here, I'm just getting prepared to glue the two pieces of the saya together. Technically, I could do all of the profiling and the shaping after I glue them, but I wanted to do it beforehand because I wanted it to be slightly easier to align them perfectly.
I'm low-key stressed about this.
As I put the glue on the inside of the saya, it's probably a good idea for me to explain why there's that little square notch near the carving of the tip. And that's because as you use saya, it fills up with a little bit of dust and oil. And if there's no place for that dust and oil to go, you could ruin the finish on the tip of the blade. So that little square notch carved into both sides helps contain that dust and that extra oil.
Okay. Whoa, that's heavy.
As the wood glue was drying, I figured it was a good time to clean up all the wood shavings that I put in the shop. I don't know if the tradition for saya is to ensure that they're always rounded. Like, I was playing with the idea of giving the saya facets. However, I knew that I was going to be painting the saya later on with a fairly complicated design, so in order to make that simpler, I was just going to leave it round and smooth.
I'm going to take a 1/4 inch off each side.
I want to keep this. Why do I have to? Why is it for a client? Why can't I just keep it?
If my client is hearing this, I was just joking. Don't worry about it. To shape the saya, I broke the corners, and then I took those corners, and then I made it round. I was actually thinking about how similar this process is to forging a circle from square stock. When you want to forge something round out of square stock, you don't go immediately to round from the square. First you break in the corners, and you get an octagon. And then from that octagon, if you're careful, you can go straight to the circle. But it's often best practice to break the corners again, and go from a 16-sided polygon to the circle.
I think it's time to use sandpaper in my hand.
I was only going to bring the saya up to a 220 grit hand rub finish. I believe that if you bring it up to too high of a finish, it's going to be harder for the paint to attach itself later to the wood. I would hate for what I painted on the wood later to just fall off later down on the line in my client's hands, so I just left it at 220 grit. Up next is something that pretty much has mythical status in the katana world, and that is the Rayskin Wrap. What I'm doing here is I'm creating a little template out of some tape that I'm going to be later wrapping around the handle so that I'll have a preform that I can just lay on top of the Rayskin to cut to shape, and I'll know that it'll fit exactly. Now, this technique isn't original for me yet again. I stole it from Ilya, but it worked really well in hindsight, so I'm not going to try and find another technique knowing that this one works.
Oh shit, did I already cut it to like the perfect length?
The thing about Rayskin is that you can't just put any section of the Rayskin onto the handle. There's a central group of nodules that are the most precious part of the Rayskin, and those have to be in the center on the presentation side near the Kashira. If I were to misalign those central nodules and put them on the side of the handle, they would actually be completely covered by the Ito wrap, making them pretty much worthless. One cool thing about the nodules on the Ito wrap is that they're made of the same stuff that your teeth are made out of. That made cutting it kind of a pain, and I didn't have anything better to cut them with other than these scissors. So I made sure to cut outside the line just a little bit so that I had some room for error.
Why are you going in? Oh yeah, that smells great. Nice. That feels kind of cool.
To sand the Rayskin to its final dimension, I couldn't just put it flat on the table and push it into the grinder. I actually had to put a piece of wood under it because of the fact that the Rayskin wasn't entirely rigid. Because of the fact that it wasn't rigid, without the wood, the Rayskin would just get pulled into the grinder. But with the wood underneath, it allowed me to sand it to the exact dimension that I wanted it to be.
I really need to make sure that these nodules are like centered. Give that rope some tension. Some glue there. Some glue there.
Aside from the Ito wrap itself, I think this process was one of the most physically demanding on my fingers. I had to give the rope so much pressure, and I had to ensure that the Rayskin was fitting with no bubbles. Like I said before, the Rayskin isn't entirely rigid, so if you pull on one part, it sort of gives more Rayskin to another part, and I had to make sure that that never happened.
This is kind of what it's going to feel like at the end, but slightly thinner.
With the Rayskin drying, it was time to start thinking about the Koiguchi. The Koiguchi is a protective lip that you put on the front of the saya. The saya is made of a soft wood, and when you slam it onto the blade, the hard metal of the blade is going to sort of imprint the front of the saya, so you need something a little bit tougher. The material that I have here is ironwood, and ironwood is one of the toughest woods that I know of. It's pretty dense, I think it sinks in water, and it's also one of the worst smelling woods on the planet. Like, I don't really know how to describe it, but it's just rancid. Like, it fills your nose, and you can taste it. The Koiguchi that I made is definitely not entirely traditional, but I would also be a liar if I said I was aiming to make this build completely traditional. Like, starting off, my blade isn't even made out of the traditional steels. I made it out of 1084 and 5920 twist Damascus. So I'm not really too pressed about the fact that my Koiguchi isn't wrapping around the wood, but rather sitting on top. With the wood glue dry now, it was time to basically sand the ironwood flush to the rest of the saya. Unfortunately, since the next step of the saya is painting the entire thing black, I won't be able to see the ironwood on the side of the saya, but I'm going to be covering the front of the saya with some tape so that I can see the ironwood when the saya is off of the blade.
I think in order to paint it, I need something to hold it with. And the blade is kind of perfect because it's like a handle sticking out of it.
The paint that I'm using to cover the saya is actually just some plain old black acrylic paint. I wanted the hurricanes that I paint in the Fujiwara effect to pop out as much as possible. And because hurricanes are generally white, black was just the go-to color.
Ooh, that's gonna look sick.
I always talk about things being satisfying when I make knives, like maybe spraying soapy water on some of the dark sludge that comes onto the blade when I hand sand. But I don't actually think anything's been more satisfying than just simply painting the saya. I did take art classes for a few years when I was little, but I never really took painting classes.
Welcome to random Asian dude, Bob Ross. If I can do this, you guys owe me a sub. Oh my god. Looks like you guys owe me a sub.
But yeah, with the black paint now drying, it was time to finally shape the guard into an actual comfortable guard. This is one of the areas that I really wanted to improve on as compared to Enma. My process was to first break the corners like I did on every single thing else before that I needed to round out, and then I took it to some surface conditioning belts. Now, these surface conditioning belts are pretty similar to the Scotch-Brite on the back of your sponge that you use to wash dishes. However, they're in a 2x72 format and I can throw them on my belt grinder. After going through the finest grit of the surface conditioning belts, it was time to take it over to the buffer. On my buffer, I had a wheel loaded with green compound and a wheel loaded with white compound. The green compound is a little bit rougher, and it's a little bit more abrasive, meaning that it helps take out the rest of the scratches that the Scotch-Brite couldn't catch. The white compound is a lot finer, and it's on a softer wheel, so it takes that almost mirror-like finish and turns it into an actual mirror.
It's so shiny, I can't tell like where some of the dark spots are. They kind of just look like reflections. Like it's actually just a mirror. Because my client is a meteorologist, I'm gonna make some thunderbolts.
So, what are Menuki? Menuki are basically a pair of decorative ornaments that you put under the Ito wrap and on top of the Rayskin. There's actually a couple reasons why the Menuki exist. The first of which is that they can actually improve the grip of the user on the katana handle. If you look at your hand, it's not entirely flat. There's actually a bit of a dish. So by putting the Menuki under the wrap, you give the handle a bit of the bulge right where your palms would be. And like I said before, these Menuki are also pieces of art that you put on the katana handle. They can be made of brass, it can be made of copper, but the more expensive ones can also be made of silver or even gold. I chose brass for my thunderbolts because, first of all, they're a little bit stronger than gold and also a little bit less scary to work with. And also, they have the perfect hue of yellow for that traditional thunderbolt look. To help emphasize the fact that these were indeed decorative ornaments, I beveled the edges of the lightning bolts. Because of how small these Menuki were, my grinding skills were really tested. Once I was happy with the facets, it was time to take it over to the buffer and give it that nice shine. Unfortunately, the Menuki are actually mostly covered by the Ito wrap, but that doesn't mean that underneath that Ito wrap, they can't be pristine.
Alright.
With the Rayskin now completely dried to the handle, it was time to start wrapping it. In my opinion, the Ito wrap on a katana handle is more definitively katana than the hamon on the blade itself. There's so many ways in which hamons can be put on other blades, but the Ito wrap is so purely Japanese katana. There are a few things that I had to keep in mind as I was wrapping the handle. The first of which was that the katana wrap has to be under a lot of pressure. Over time, as you use the handle, it'll start to loosen up, and if it doesn't already have a lot of tension in it, it'll get too loose and the Menuki will fall out.
I somehow need to do the wrap with the Menuki under here. I put it on the wrong side. Wow. I have to start with it like up here and pull it down.
Continuing what I was talking about before, the other thing that I have to keep in mind is that the diamonds in between the wraps need to be about the same size. If they were bigger in one place and smaller in the other, it would look really messy.
The twists need to be already there.
It might not look like it, but most of the Ito wrap is actually very, very simple. It's the same knot over and over again. The complicated part is the knot at the bottom of the handle.
Is the wire catching on something?
It might be kind of hard to visualize, but there's actually two parts to the knot at the end of the handle. There's one on the Ura side and one on the other side. I forgot the name of the other side.
Yes. This goes like this. Oh, I think I know what to do. Rather than a big needle and a follow needle, it needs to be two needles.
The really difficult part about this knot is that I have to do it when everything is super tight. So just pulling the string under another string is really difficult. Also, just in case you were wondering, they actually do ask for some sort of adhesive at this part of the knot.
Now I need to get this to go under it. Please. Yeah. Apparently I'm supposed to get a tiny wad of paper in there. This one's still kind of big. Wad of paper. Just like right there. Yeah, the wad of paper makes it so that it doesn't get loose. Okay, so the last thing I need to do is to jam it under here. I think that's it.
Now that I was completely done with the handle, it was time to drill the hole and get it perfectly aligned to the tang so that after I put a pin in there, it makes everything tight and the blade is pretty much ready to use. I think if I were to do it again, I would have drilled the holes before I did any of the Ito wrap, and that's because I didn't want to have to worry about the drill bit digging into the Ito wrap and me having to start over. The pin that keeps the katana together was traditionally made out of a really hard piece of bamboo called susudake. I didn't have access to any of that, or at least on short notice, so I decided to make the first pin that I made out of stabilized Tasmanian blackwood. Note my careful use of the word first there. This pin was actually pretty good, but once I put it in and tried to take it out, the pin split apart.
I broke the pin.
Off camera, I made another pin out of vintage micarta, and I have to say it works pretty perfectly. You're probably wondering, hey Jesse, why are you cleaning off your tang for your maker's mark? Isn't that supposed to be on the blade? The thing about the maker's marks in Japanese katana is that they're actually supposed to be on the tang. Katana are takedown, so the tang isn't completely hidden from view at all times. It's not like a Bowie, where if you epoxy it to the handle, you'll never see it again. At this point in the katana making process, I could tell that I was getting pretty close to the finish line. There were still a couple things that I had to do, but that doesn't mean that I couldn't see the light at the end of the tunnel and see how far I've come. With the maker's mark now etched, it was time to start thinking about etching my Damascus pattern. Off camera, I did a couple things. The first of which was I sanded the blade up to a 600 grit finish. It was a pristine 600 grit finish, all parallel scratches, and I also made 2 more ABS tubes. One of which was going to be for coffee later, but the other was for a solution of baking soda. The baking soda tube would be for neutralizing the ferric after the ferric etch. This would make it so that I wouldn't have to worry about any over-etching. After washing the blade multiple times with just regular dish soap, it was time to put it into the ferric solution. Finally, after 3 weeks of work, I could finally see the pattern that I put into the blade.
2-minute timer. Alright. What is this gonna look like? Ooh. Nice, let's fucking go. Neutralize it. You know that like storm on Jupiter? Every single one of these looks like a storm.
The solution that I just dipped the blade into was something called ferric chloride. The ferric chloride eats away at the metal, and it also etches just a little bit of depth into the blade. I really like a little bit of chatoyance in my Damascus finish, and the only way to do that is with ferric chloride. If I were to do only a coffee etch, I would get that nice dark and white contrast, but I wouldn't have any depth in the etch. It would just feel like a flat surface. What you see here after I wipe away all of the dark oxides is actually what some people prefer on their Damascus, which is a really low contrast finish. The depth is still there, but there's no contrast in the color. Once I got all the oxides off of the entire blade and off of the spine, it was time to do a second ferric chloride etch just for that extra depth.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah, there's the contrast that comes just from the depth.
With all the oxides rubbed off from the ferric chloride etches, it was finally time for the coffee etch. In my opinion, this is where the Damascus finish gets most of its soul. Just like how the blade gets its soul from the quench, the Damascus finish gets its soul from the coffee etch. There are a few things that I had to keep in mind as I was doing the coffee etch. The first of which was that I used distilled water. Any other kind of water would introduce tiny minerals and impurities to the coffee that would etch the blade in a slightly different way. Another thing that I made sure to do was to not take out the blade too early from the coffee. Sometimes the wet finish makes it look darker than it actually is. So if you pull the blade out of the coffee slightly too early, you won't really be able to tell, but later on, the blade will be a lot lighter than it should be. While the blade was etching away in the coffee, it was time to start thinking about the design that I would put on the saya. My client actually gave me a pretty nice reference image for the Fujiwara effect that he wanted, so I spent a lot of time looking at the image, looking at what I was painting, to really try and make sure that everything that I was painting was as representative of the Fujiwara effect as possible. With the paint on the saya now drying and the artwork complete, it was time to start the very last piece of this entire build, which was to engrave a compass on the bottom of the Kashira with the north symbol pointing toward the spine of the blade. I really think that this brings the entire build together, and it helps accentuate the fact that this blade is for a retiring meteorologist.
Oh yeah! Words cannot explain how cool I think this is gonna look.
But yeah, with all that said and the blade nearing completion, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you enjoy the B-roll as well.